This is a painting that I made. This is a self-portrait. I wanted to share the process of this painting and talk about how I make my gouache portraits. So let's get into it. Before I even start painting, there are a few steps that I usually do to start my process. I always start my process with a sketch. As I've been working on my painting process with gouache, I've found that it's really important to start with a good sketch. I'm a lot better at drawing than painting, so having this solid foundation for my paintings is helpful. I'm not always super precious with my sketches, but when I started this one, I knew I'd also be painting it, so I drew the grid beforehand. The grid helps me with proportions and prevents me from ending up with a face that is skewed or distorted. As I was working, I didn't like how the sketch looked, so I used a kneaded eraser to lift the entire drawing. By softly erasing everything, I can go back in and redefine these areas. Kneaded erasers are also great because they don't have the mess of eraser shavings. Next, I transfer this drawing from my sketchbook onto a piece of watercolor paper using a light pad. The watercolor paper that I used for this painting is this stuff. This is cold pressed watercolor paper, so this paper has some texture. For most of my paintings, I usually use the Arches brand or the Fluid brand, and I also usually prefer hot pressed paper, which is smoother. I think this is only the second time I've used this paper. It's nice, it's just a size I don't normally use. So starting this painting in my sketchbook and then transferring the sketch to watercolor paper helps me keep the watercolor paper as clean as possible, and I don't have to deal with the eraser marks and pencil marks from my sketch. After transferring the drawing, the next step is to tape the back side of the paper. I tape it onto this piece of scrap MDF board, which I have left over from an old project, but I've also used cardboard or drawing boards for other paintings. I used to tape the borders of my paintings on the front side of the paper, but because I make a lot of really small paintings, I don't do that anymore because I don't want a huge white border on my paintings. As for supplies, I should also say that I'll be using Holbein Artist Gouache. I have the primary color mixing set, and I also have this glass plate that I use as a mixing palette. Now, getting to the actual painting part of the process, I spray the paper with water using a small squirt bottle, and then I cover the paper with a bright base layer. The water just helps to thin out the paint and makes it easier to spread, and it helps keep the paint at a thinner consistency so that it doesn't cover the drawing. I usually use warm colors like red, pink, or orange for the beginning of my portraits. I do this base layer for a few different reasons. The first reason is that working on white paper is intimidating. I also think it's harder to mix colors when comparing them to the white paper. Any color on top of white will look super dark, and that messes with the overall values and tones of the painting. Another reason is that as I continue working on the painting, I don't need to worry about covering all of the paper. If there are spots that I don't cover, then it's not the white of the paper that shows through. I also think it just looks nice when bits of the background are still left uncovered in the final painting. After this first layer of paint is dry, I use a small detail brush to do some black line work. There's not a specific reason that I do this, except that I tried it once and I liked how it made my painting look, so now I do it for all of my paintings. I think it's kind of like how in oil painting you work from dark to light. The idea is that placing these darkest values first helps with the illusion of depth in a painting, and it's a good idea to keep darker areas thin, as it's harder to layer darker paint on top of light paint if it's already super thick on the paper. Another reason that I do this black line work is that it helps preserve my drawing. I spent a decent amount of prep time on my sketch and then transferring it over, and I don't want to lose it under the paint I'm about to put down. The pencil marks from the sketch are covered pretty quickly in the painting process, but these black paint lines will make sure that I can keep these lines throughout the painting process. Okay, now this is the step that is actually painting. I start the painting process with the hair. In my previous paintings, I've started with the face, and it's usually the skin that I start with first, but I've noticed that I get frustrated trying to mix the right skin tones. Out of all of the painting mediums, gouache seems to have an especially ugly phase, and if I start with the face itself and I experience that ugly phase, it's really hard to stay motivated in painting. But I really like doing the hair, so that's where I start instead. And then when I experience the ugly phase, I still have, that nice hair to look at, and I feel more invested in the painting, and I'm less likely to give up on a piece. Back to that idea about how oil paintings go from dark to light, I do something a little different with my process, and it's something that I think works especially well with gouache. In each section of the painting that I work on, I start with more of a medium value, and then I work both darker and lighter. So for the hair, I started with a brown color, and then I added more black shadows and then lighter brown and peach highlights. I think this way of working helps my paintings look really dimensional, and it also helps me get the proper value range. So instead of going from dark to light, I go kind of middle to both dark and light. I'm not completely done with the hair yet, but I'm now moving on to the skin. Another important part of my process is that I try to slowly move around the whole painting. I do try to find a solid balance of being able to focus on one area for a decent amount of time, but I don't want to spend so much time in one area that it feels disconnected from everything else. As I start to work on the skin, I know that I'm going to need quite a few layers of paint to get it to how I want it to look. So now I'm just trying to block in some general shapes and colors. I try to avoid painting just one base color for an area. Instead, I use a bunch of similar colors to slowly fill in this entire area of the painting. I also loosely block in the irises of the eyes, but I'll end up repainting these later. I said that I get frustrated painting the skin, and I've already reached that point, so I take a break to work on the background. When I started the background, I thought I knew what I wanted it to look like, which was very dark and saturated, and maybe it would also gradient outward to black. So I started to put down some of these very dark colors, mostly blues and purples. As I was building up the opacity of the colors in the background, I was trying to introduce more hue variation. A lot of the portraits I normally do have solid backgrounds, but I wanted this background to be a bit more visually interesting. So I started with some dark blue colors, but then added some variation with the purple and the greens. Maybe you've noticed that these colors are getting lighter. I wasn't satisfied with how this looked just yet, but I kept developing these colors and textures later on in the painting. After loosely painting this first version of the background, I now have the entire paper covered, and that means the first layer of the painting is done. At this point, I know that the next step is to start rendering the face, but I'm putting it off by going in with black line work again instead. So I'm kind of just procrastinating at this moment, but making sure that these darkest areas of the painting are defined helps me make sure that I'm getting the complete range of values in my painting. I also like having a slightly graphic or stylized appearance to my paintings, which is why I added the black outline around the jawline, for example. I have a fairly realistic style to my paintings, but this is one of the things that I do to add a little bit more character and personality to my work. Now I'm working on the face itself again. The way that I approach these gouache paintings is that I start with very thin layers of paint, almost like I'm using watercolors. And then as I work, I'm slowly adding thicker and more opaque layers of paint. At this point in the painting is when I've entered the ugly stage. This is an inevitable part of every painting, and what I've noticed is that a lot of the times it happens at this part of the process, at the beginning of the rendering process, basically. Part of the issue for me is that I don't like the appearance of gouache when it's used in these thin layers. There's just something that looks off to me about its texture. But it's important to have these layers as a foundation, so as the painting progresses, I'm just focused on getting these areas covered up. But I'm also trying to be intentional about what I'm doing. It could be tempting to just mix one general light skin tone color to just paint over the whole skin area to make a clean base. But what I do instead is to take my time mixing small areas of color and focusing on creating small shapes of color with slow, clean brush strokes. As I do this, I'm also trying to exaggerate some of the shapes and colors. I realized I was kind of neglecting the lighting in my portrait, so I started building up more shadow areas on the right side of the face. And it felt like I immediately went way too dark with these colors, but instead of trying to blend it out or take it back, I slowly add more lighter shadow colors on top. This is another comparison I'm going to make to oil painting. A lot of oil painters don't necessarily blend their paintings. Instead, they use transitional colors, which are basically saturated shades on the edge of a shadow. So on top of that dark purple, adding these lighter and more saturated pink colors looks good. While I continue to paint the face, I just wanted to briefly talk about how I edited this video. The original footage from this process was about 4.5 hours long, and this painting is about 6 by 6 inches big. Most of the portraits that I do are about 4 by 4 inches big, and they usually take me between 2 and 4 hours to do. So this painting is a little bit bigger than I would normally work when I do my gouache portraits, but it didn't take me that much longer to paint. Back to the editing process, the way that I edited this video is that the vast majority of the stuff that I cut out from this video was either me mixing paint or some of the more boring or repetitive parts of the process. I cut out most of the sketching and drawing at the beginning of the video and all of the time that my hands were out of the frame because I was mixing my paint. And then I could showcase the more interesting parts of the process so you could see the actual brush strokes that built up this painting. At this point, I'm working on the hair again, adding warmer browns and mid-tone colors to this area. Honestly, what I did just now was kind of a mistake, and I did not like how it looked at the time. But there's no undo button when painting, so I just moved elsewhere until I could figure out what to do. I noticed everything was looking very cool toned and on the pinker side. The skin just all of a sudden looked so pink and purple, so I felt like I needed to add warmer colors down here as well. So I added a similar warm brown color to the skin, and this was also a mistake. An entire series of questionable artistic choices was what was happening in this part of the painting at this point. That being said, I feel like I paint slowly. If this video is about 20 minutes long, it's hard for me to conceptualize how this represents less than 10% of the entire process. And just because I can cut out the boring bits from the video, I can't do that in real life. And in the grand scheme of things, I think making a piece of art that I think looks great and that I'm proud of in less than 5 hours is pretty amazing. So if it's helpful to know, if you think my painting looks good too and this video went by super quickly, but you feel like your painting process is very slow, just know that I'm watching the same video and I feel the same exact way. I want to explain the way that I'm blending some of these colors here. This is absolutely my favorite part about using gouache. I'm someone who doesn't like having to put in the effort to blend my paint, but gouache doesn't need to be blended the way that other paint mediums might need to be blended. Because gouache can be reactivated with water, I will do a lot of brush strokes repeated in the same area, and then whatever color I have on my paintbrush gets blended into whatever color is on the paper as it gets wetted. And then these two colors mix in a really interesting way. Now I'm working on the background again, and I'm still unsure about how I want it to look. I'm adding warmer green tones at the bottom, and then I'm trying to find the right shade of purple for the top. I ended up with a purple, blue, green gradient, which I think complements the pink, orange, yellow tones in the skin and hair. I kind of just said all of the colors, but I mean the purple at the top is a complement to the yellow in the hair at the top. The overall teal at the bottom is a complement of the overall coral or salmon color situation on the skin. I think it's really interesting how this painting doesn't read as having a rainbow color palette, but I've pretty much used all of the colors. As I said earlier, I typically work on portraits at a smaller size, and I'm used to doing backgrounds that are just one flat color. Because this portrait is bigger and more of the background is visible, it was a challenge to find the right solution for this background. When I was layering all of these different colors, I was feeling a little frustrated. It feels a little bit wasteful sometimes to layer paints in a way that is a bit unnecessary, but I want to emphasize the fact that gouache is a paint medium that layers so beautifully, so it's never a waste to put down a color that might get covered up or a color that needs to get covered up. And the way that I layer colors has become such a big part of my art style. One final thing about the background is that I felt like it was looking kind of messy, but not in a way that felt intentional. To me, it looked like I was trying to paint a clean gradient, but I didn't do a very good job and it looked a bit unfinished. To try to make it look more purposeful, I started adding spots and texture to the background by bringing some purple lower into the blue and adding bits of blue higher into the purple. I like the effect that this has, and I feel like it makes the background look a lot more dynamic and playful. We're in the end game now. This is the part of the process where I think the painting looks pretty good, but it's now just about making it look more finished and polished. I don't think there's much to say about the rest of this process here. It's just about noticing the parts of the painting that still look unfinished or things that look off and then fixing them. I could have probably spent hours just adjusting and tweaking things, but I like to make my portrait paintings fairly quickly, and I try to avoid overworking them too much. Some things that needed some extra touches were the ears, the nose, and then the eyes. And I also added some texture like freckles and blemishes across the face. This painting isn't perfect. Some things could look better, but I do really like this painting. I like making self-portraits, but it's been a long time since I've painted one. I've done a few self-portraits digitally, but I'm pretty sure it's been at least a few years since I made one with paint. Since I've been making so many gouache portraits recently on Instagram, it just made sense to finally paint myself again. I still think there were some more things that I could have fixed while I was trying to finish up this painting. This painting isn't perfect, but again, I do really like it. I'm especially proud of the colors and the brushwork, especially in the skin area, which is the area that I struggled with the most. I think there are a lot of wonderful colors and brush strokes. I think the brushwork in general stands out in this painting. If I had tried to make this portrait digitally, I can guarantee that I would have tried to blend out a lot of these areas and I would have lost out on that. I don't think anything about this painting was effortless, but there is something that looks so easy and carefree about these brush strokes. And that's something that I notice my favorite artists doing, and I'm always trying to copy that aspect of their art. So that's probably what I like the most about this painting. While I finish this painting, I want to mention some other things about my painting process that I didn't explain in this video. The first thing is about the brushes that I used for the beginning of the painting, and while painting bigger areas, I use a size 6 flat brush. As I get further into the painting and try to paint smaller areas, I switch to a smaller flat brush, a size 8. And then for the black line work that I do, and when I'm trying to paint small details and highlights, I use a small round brush, size 5/0. I've experimented with a lot of different brushes in my work, and I even had a phase where I only used filbert brushes, but I've learned that I prefer the look of flat brushes in my paintings. I like the shapes they create, and I feel like they have more control in laying flat patches of color more smoothly. One more thing about my painting process, I'm not including this in the video, but the final step that I take for every painting is that I flatten it. Even though I tape my paintings before I start working on them, inevitably they will still get slightly warped as I paint them. So when I'm done with this painting, I will wet the back of the paper with a brush and some water, and then I leave it under a stack of books overnight, and that makes my paintings flat again and they look more professional as well. We're almost at the final result, and now I'm finished talking about my gouache portrait painting process. Hopefully this was a very thorough but not boring explanation of how I make my portraits. Let me know what you think.